My husband brazenly brought his mistress and their illegitimate child into our home, and my in-laws stood firmly behind them. The very next day, a once-in-a-century typhoon struck. During the day, torrential rain lashed against the windows, and they forced me to go out in search of supplies. By nightfall, the mistress had taken over the master bedroom, leaving my daughter and me to huddle in the cramped storage balcony. In the dead of night, the typhoon shattered the glass of the balcony, sweeping my daughter and me off the 23rd floor. We both met our tragic end. When I opened my eyes again, I found myself back a week before the storm hit. This time, I am determined to protect myself and my daughter, and I will make that wretched family pay for their sins. Chapter 1. Yummy, my parents are here. Go buy some decent food, don't embarrass me with your stinginess. The sound of the door opening was quickly followed by my husband Ethan's grating voice. I snapped back to reality and glanced at the phone screen in my hand. It was June 28th. You useless woman. After all these years, you still don't have any sense? The elders arrive, and you just sit there in the room without even a greeting. In the few seconds I had been lost in thought, my father-in-law's displeased voice echoed from the doorway. His familiar words sent a chill down my spine. This wasn't a dream. I remembered being humiliated by the mistress, insulted by my in-laws, and how my daughter and I were swept off the building by a typhoon, dying instantly. And now, I found myself back on the day my in-laws suddenly moved into my home, just a week before the disaster struck. In my previous life, my in-laws, who had always lived in the countryside, suddenly decided to move in, claiming they missed their son and wanted to stay for a while. Only later did I realize their true intentions. At that time, they had already planned to bring the mistress and her illegitimate child into our home. My in-laws moved in first to pressure me into submission. They called my daughter a useless burden and a jinx, forcing me to share my husband with the mistress and act as their servant. They even wanted me to transfer the house that my husband and I had bought together to the mistress so their illegitimate child could attend a good school. Of course, I refused. I was preparing to see a lawyer the next day to resolve the issue. Then, the once-in-a-century typhoon disaster struck. Typhoons seemed to conspire, one after another, unleashing relentless downpours day and night. With so many people suddenly in the house, the remaining supplies could last only 2 or 3 days. They forced me to wade through waist-deep water to find food. Later, when the floodwaters rose several floors high, making it impossible to go outside, they tied up my daughter and threatened me to sleep with men in the building in exchange for supplies. Even then, my daughter and I had nowhere to sleep. The master bedroom was occupied by my husband and the mistress, my daughter's room was taken by the illegitimate child, and the guest room was claimed by my in-laws. My daughter and I could only sleep in the drafty balcony storage room. But the unreinforced balcony glass couldn't withstand the raging typhoon, and my daughter and I were swept off the 23rd floor in our sleep, perishing on impact. My last memory was of my daughter's twisted body falling beside me, her terrified eyes filled with blood. Thinking of my poor daughter and the humiliation I endured, my heart felt like it had exploded with rage. Given another chance, I would make Ethan and his family pay in blood. Chapter 2. I took a deep breath and walked out of the bedroom. I couldn't act impulsively. Confronting them directly would leave me at a disadvantage. The typhoon was on its way, and soon, they would face their reckoning. Mom and Dad, I'm sorry. I just woke up. There's fresh fish and shrimp in the fridge. I'll prepare dinner for you. I attempted to appear humble and submissive. However, my mother-in-law rolled her eyes and threw a large woven bag at me. We come all this way, and you want to serve us something so plain? I want braised pork, rib soup, and stewed pork knuckle. And make sure to prepare those sweet potatoes I brought. My father-in-law, already annoyed that I hadn't greeted them properly, chimed in. Honestly, living off my son and not even providing some decent meat. Sooner or later, we'll kick you out to teach you a lesson. Ethan and I had started dating in our sophomore year. When my parents tragically died in a car accident during our senior year, Ethan seized the opportunity to propose to me, the vulnerable girl I was. I agreed, thinking I had found my protector. After marriage, he seemed devoted, and I believed I had found true love. I entrusted him with my parents' inheritance to invest in his startup. Looking back now, his post-marriage devotion was merely a fad to gain control over my inheritance. I had been utterly blinded by love. Once he obtained the money, Ethan changed completely. He immersed himself in debauchery and shamelessly brought the mistress and her child into our home, envisioning a twisted polygamous life. "All right, I'll go to the market and buy the meat. You all rest for a bit." I longed to strangle them, but I maintained a gentle smile on my face. The more satisfied they were now, the more I would relish their impending misery. Chapter 3. The next morning, I took my daughter and a small suitcase, telling them it was for a school trip, and we left the house. Before departing, I secretly took my husband's ID and phone and installed several hidden cameras around the house. When I announced my intention to leave, my in-laws, who typically demanded my presence as their maid, didn't seem upset. Instead, they appeared pleased. I knew they were planning to welcome the mistress and her child into our home. I left to prepare for the impending typhoon disaster, ensuring the mistress and her child would be present when it struck, leaving them with no chance to escape. "Mom, why are we lying to Dad and Grandma and Grandpa?" My daughter, now in middle school, was quite perceptive. She didn't understand why I suddenly wanted to leave, but she always stood by me, never undermining my authority in front of my husband and in-laws. It wasn't until we got into the car that she voiced her confusion. I felt a pang of sorrow. "Moon, something terrible is going to happen in a few days, and Dad and Grandma and Grandpa will hurt us. I have to take you away. Can you keep this a secret for me?" Seeing the seriousness of my expression, Moon's face turned grave. She nodded vigorously, clutching her small backpack tightly. "Of course. I'll always be Mom's best friend." With my daughter's unwavering trust, I felt a flicker of hope. We still had a week left, ample time to prepare. I drove straight to a newly developed residential area on the outskirts of the city. Although I had foolishly given my parents' inheritance to that scumbag for investment, I had an old house that was too run down to interest my husband, allowing it to escape his clutches. Last year, the old house was suddenly slated for demolition, and I received a new house on the outskirts along with a compensation package. Thankfully, I had begun to wake up from the illusion of marriage and didn't inform my husband about it. Now, it was a lifeline for my daughter and me. A contractor from a window company I had contacted earlier was already waiting for me. The new house was on the 12th floor. Though not as high as our previous home, it still needed reinforcement. The compensation amount was $500,000, and I wasn't about to skimp on safety. It needed to be spent wisely. I instructed the contractor to use the finest materials to replace and reinforce the windows and doors, emphasizing urgency. I needed it completed within a week. Upon hearing that money was no object, the contractor readily agreed, beginning measurements immediately and promising timely delivery. Next, I surveyed the house inside and out. Fortunately, it was a well-finished property, and the quality was decent. I would only need to purchase some appliances and furniture to settle in with my daughter. After calculating the remaining compensation, I used my husband's phone and ID to max out all possible online loans, transferring the funds to my account and erasing all records. The scumbag had excellent credit, and I managed to secure nearly 5 million yuans. Since he was practically a dead man walking, I might as well use his money. This would be enough for my daughter and me to survive the impending typhoon apocalypse. As for repayment later, we would cross that bridge when we came to it. Watching my daughter explore our new home with delight, warmth flooded my heart. This time, I would ensure our survival. Chapter 4. The new residential area was relatively secluded, with few residents. For safety, I hired a renovation company to add an extra layer of soundproofing to the rooms and bought thick blackout curtains, claiming that my daughter was learning the piano and I didn't want to disturb the neighbors. During such times of scarce resources, a mother and daughter like us could easily become targets. Minimizing our presence was crucial. For 2 days, I shopped with my daughter, ensuring we had all the necessary furniture and appliances, as well as an air purification system, a water purifier, purification tablets, several small generators, and solar panels. After the typhoon disaster, many areas experienced power outages, so I needed to be well prepared. Once the major items were set up, I didn't take a break. I rushed to the market to buy supplies. First on my list were non-perishable foods. I purchased dozens of boxes of instant noodles, compressed biscuits, sausages, self-heating meals, freeze-dried vegetables, and dried mushrooms and seaweed. While these might not be the most nutritious options, they would ensure our survival. Next, I bought several loads of fresh meat, paying a little extra for the vendor to cut it into small pieces and package it in batches. I also stocked up on my daughter's favorites: fish, shrimp, hot pot ingredients, ice cream, dumplings, and more. I reluctantly stopped when the freezers were nearly full. I ordered a batch of bottled water, but concerned about the weight on the house, I called several neighbors who hadn't moved in yet, asking to rent their apartments under the pretext of setting up an office. Fortunately, one of the neighbors was an old family friend who had moved abroad with her children and readily agreed to rent to me. We lived in a 2-unit per floor building, so I had a contractor secretly install a sturdy security door at the elevator entrance. This way, it would be safer to retrieve supplies from the neighbor's place. With less than a week until the disaster, even if the property management noticed and tried to intervene, it would be too late. After confirming I had enough storage space, I bought enough household medicines, toilet paper, sanitary products, spices, laundry detergent, and other essentials to last 2 to 3 years. Finally, I purchased plenty of snacks and books for my daughter, as well as a gaming console. To endure the apocalypse, basic supplies were essential, but so were mental needs. As I checked off items from my extensive list, my anxiety began to subside. With this preparation, barring any unforeseen circumstances, my daughter and I could stay in our new home for a year or 2 without issues. I had faith in the government. Even in the face of a once-in-a-century disaster, they would restore order within a year. "Mom, are we going to stay in the new home and wait for the typhoon?" My daughter asked nervously. She had gradually understood the situation, but rather than crying or complaining, she volunteered to be my little helper. I smiled and shook my head. "We need to go back home and get the things we couldn't take. Every little bit helps, and I didn't want to leave anything for that family." Chapter 5. Despite my busy schedule over the past few days, I found time to check the home surveillance footage. As I suspected, the day after I left, my husband and in-laws brought the mistress and her son into the house. When Ethan saw my daughter and me suddenly return, he was momentarily taken aback but quickly resumed his entitled demeanor. "Good timing. I was wondering how to introduce you to Chonkian," he said, casually wrapping his arm around the mistress's waist. The woman named Chonkian leaned into Ethan, a provocative smile playing on her lips as she looked at me. "Hello, sis. I'll be joining the family from now on. Please take care of me," she said sweetly. I couldn't help but roll my eyes inwardly. This mistress must have watched too many soap operas as a child. She had no idea that the apocalypse was approaching and was still trying to compete with me. Seeing my silent expression, my mother-in-law, likely thinking I was about to explode with anger, quickly grabbed the chubby boy next to her and shot me a fierce glare. "Don't be ungrateful. You've been married for years and haven't produced a son. In our hometown, you wouldn't even qualify for a land grant. Ethan hasn't divorced you out of kindness. A wise woman should be generous to keep the family harmonious." "All right, I didn't say I disagreed," I interrupted, unable to contain myself any longer. Feeling my daughter's trembling beside me, I glanced at Ethan and the woman beside him, forcing a bitter smile. "I've noticed the signs for a while. I'm not stupid. But what can I do? Chonkian is here now, let's all get along." Seeing my response, my in-laws exchanged smug glances. Chapter 6. In their eyes, it was only natural for me, the perpetually weak and easily bullied daughter-in-law, to react this way. Even my husband showed no particular emotion, just letting out a long sigh. A deep sadness washed over me. Having endured for so long, they believed I deserved to suffer everything. Even with my daughter still by my side, they were completely unrestrained, disregarding her feelings entirely. In truth, I hadn't planned to bring my daughter back. But she seemed to sense everything and insisted on returning to support me. "I'm starving," Grandma, I want pork knuckles, I want chicken legs. The chubby boy, tightly held by my mother-in-law, suddenly started shouting and broke free from her grasp, grabbing a toy from the floor and throwing it. My heart dropped when I saw that he was throwing my daughter's most treasured doll. A surge of anger rose within me, and I was about to intervene when my daughter gently pulled me back. In that moment, I was taken aback by her expression. Her eyes were red, yet she was forcing a smile and shaking her head. I understood immediately. She knew what I wanted to do. She would rather endure some hardship herself to protect me. I squeezed my daughter's small hand tightly, suppressing the urge to lash out at the chubby boy. Don't cry, don't cry. It's Auntie's fault. Didn't you want pork knuckles? Auntie will make them for you, I said soothingly. My mother-in-law shot me a glare. At your age, you still can't handle a child. Hurry up and cook. Stop being a nuisance. I cast a long look at this family. 2 adults and 2 elders were doting on the chubby boy, treating my daughter and me like mere servants. I quickly led my daughter away, discreetly returning Ethan's phone and ID to their place. Compared to the millions I had taken, a single pork knuckle was nothing. Go ahead and eat. Let's see how long you can maintain this arrogance. In the following days, I continued to manage the household, cooking for the entire family. They assumed I had accepted this twisted polygamous lifestyle, which played right into my plan. Every day when I left the house, I secretly moved some of our belongings to the new home, my daughter's toys, books, our clothes, and stored food. I wanted them to gradually experience the reality of running out of supplies. I left just enough food in the fridge for daily meals. Once the typhoon hit, I wondered if they could last 3 days without me to find food for them. As the date of the typhoon approached, the weather worsened, with no sunlight and dark clouds looming. While eating, the news on TV announced, in the coming days, experts predict several powerful typhoons will make landfall along our coast. But apart from my daughter and me, no one else in the house seemed to pay attention. After all, typhoons came every year, usually lasting 10 days to 2 weeks. Who would have thought this year would bring a once-in-a-century disaster? A cruel smile curled on my lips as I awaited the long-anticipated typhoon and torrential rains. Chapter 7. Ethan, I signed our daughter up for a study tour in H City for half a month. I'll take her to catch the flight soon. I suddenly interjected while they were talking. As expected, my in-laws immediately frowned and started scolding me. What's the point of going? A girl doesn't need to participate in these things. You can't earn a penny yourself and just waste our Cheng's money. Besides, there's so much work at home. Who will do it if you leave? The mistress Chongqian also rolled her eyes, continuously putting meat into her son's bowl. Exactly, those study tours are scams. Sister, don't be fooled. I knew they didn't want me to spend money on my daughter. Moreover, now I was the maid for this whole family. If I left, who would serve them? I remained calm and smiled. Don't worry, I hired a housekeeper to come daily for cooking and cleaning. Also, Mom and Dad, my friend in H City, said they brought many expensive health supplements from abroad to give me. Since my parents are gone, I thought I'd bring them back for you. As expected, my in-laws' frowns immediately relaxed. But there was no housekeeper or health supplements. What awaited them was a strong typhoon and an empty kitchen and fridge. Ethan's face also softened at my words. He even fished out 50 yuan from his pocket and handed it to our daughter. Daddy only has this much cash. Buy some snacks and come back soon. Grandpa, Grandma, and your brother will miss you. My daughter took the 50 yuan without a word. I couldn't help but sneer inwardly. Miss her? More like afraid no one would be there to serve their precious son. These days, even though my daughter was only in middle school, they treated her like my little maid, making her take care of their precious grandson and run errands. I wanted my daughter to stay at the new house, but she insisted on staying with me. Fortunately, this life was finally coming to an end. That afternoon, I quickly took my daughter and left, stopping by the market to buy a carload of fresh fruits and vegetables. I was lucky. Just as we got home, the sky suddenly darkened, and large raindrops began to fall. Chapter 8. The next morning, I woke up to see the small trees outside almost bent over by the wind, and the rain showed no signs of letting up. I checked the news, and sure enough, many people were starting to pay attention to the strong typhoon. Schools were closed, and some companies allowed employees to work from home. Many people joked about finally getting a typhoon holiday, but I knew this disaster was not just about strong winds but also relentless rain, claiming countless lives. I had no family left, no close friends. All I could do was protect myself and my daughter. I couldn't help others. Our abilities were limited, and whether others believed me was one thing. I feared that revealing too much would make us targets in a crisis. I could only comment on news articles, emphasizing the severity of the disaster, hoping people would stock up on supplies while they still could. If even one person saw my message and prepared, it would be worth it. My phone remained silent all day. My husband didn't even call to check if my daughter and I were safe. I checked the surveillance. I had left some food in the fridge, enough for them to feast for a day. Sure enough, none of them went out, which relieved me. I was worried they might realize the seriousness and rush out to buy supplies. On the second day of the typhoon disaster, around noon, while my daughter and I were enjoying a small hot pot, my phone rang loudly. "Hello! Yummy, where's the housekeeper you hired? She didn't come yesterday or today." My husband Ethan's agitated voice shouted from the other end. As I expected, they had feasted yesterday and now found the fridge empty, with no housekeeper in sight, causing them to panic. I pretended to be troubled. "Ah, you see the extreme weather. The housekeeper probably didn't dare to come out. You should go downstairs and buy some food. The weather might clear up in a few days." Today's weather was worse than yesterday. The water on the ground was knee-deep, and the strong wind had blown down some billboards. There were already news reports of people being injured or killed by falling objects. So even though I suggested it, knowing their selfish and cowardly nature, none of them would dare to go out. "It's all your fault. Insisting on going out at this time. Get back here now." As expected, Ethan cursed at me for a few seconds before hanging up. Chapter 9. I had just opened the surveillance to see their chaos when my daughter spoke up. "Mom, can you cast it to the TV? I want to watch too." I looked at my daughter, hesitating. I didn't want her involved too much. After all, she was just a teenager. Facing such a father and grandparents, I feared it would leave a psychological scar. But my daughter seemed to read my hesitation and smiled. "It's okay. I've known about these things for a long time. I always knew they didn't love me. I was sad at first, but now I feel as long as I have you, I'm not afraid of anything." Seeing her bright eyes, I no longer hesitated and cast the surveillance video to the TV, treating it as our entertainment. As soon as it opened, the mistress's son's cries pierced the air. "I'm starving. I want food. I want meat." Ethan sat on the sofa, looking displeased, probably still angry at me. The mistress and my mother-in-law were trying to comfort the chubby boy, my mother-in-law holding a sweet potato. "Good boy, have a sweet potato first. Grandma grew it. It's better than meat." These were the sweet potatoes my mother-in-law brought when she arrived. I felt they were unlucky, so I left them. But now, they were probably the only food left in the house. The chubby boy cried for a long time, and seeing no meat, he grabbed the golden sweet potato and devoured it. "Mom, the sweet potato in the hot pot is delicious." My daughter picked up a piece of soft sweet potato, dipped it in sauce, and took small bites. I smiled and added a few slices of freshly cooked beef to her bowl. "Yes, but don't eat too much. Sweet potatoes can cause heartburn." "Don't worry. Unlike them, we have plenty of good food to last a long time." My daughter and I shared a knowing smile. Chapter 10. In the following days, one typhoon after another hit. The news was filled with reports of windows shattered by the wind, people blown off buildings, and other tragedies. In desperation, people taped their windows in a cross pattern to withstand the strong winds. The sky seemed to have a huge hole, pouring rain non-stop. Even when the rain lessened, the water on the ground was already a floor high, making it impossible for ordinary people to go out for supplies. "Yummy, are you coming back or not?" Despite knowing our city was almost submerged, my in-laws and husband kept calling, urging and cursing me. "What can I do? Why don't you fly over and pick me up?" I laughed coldly, lying on the sofa watching TV, then contact the usual delivery guy and get us some supplies. Ethan was almost roaring. I used to participate in the community group buys and occasionally contacted the local store for deliveries during bad weather. Without me, Ethan had no idea how to buy supplies. "Are you crazy? If you don't dare go out, how can the delivery guy? Just wait. Maybe the weather will clear up in a few days." I didn't bother saying another word and hung up. These days, all they had to eat were sweet potatoes. Adults could endure, but the chubby boy cried all day about stomach pain and wanting meat. Of course, the community had a mutual aid group, and Ethan and Chonkian joined immediately. At first, people were willing to trade or sell supplies, but as the situation worsened, the group became a place for desperate pleas, with almost no responses. Now, the city was experiencing widespread power outages. Fortunately, Ethan's high-end community had its own power system, so I could still watch the surveillance for entertainment. With no other options, my husband and the mistress started pushing my in-laws to go out for supplies. "Mom, Dad, look, the baby is almost fainting from hunger. If anything happens to our precious grandson, can you live with that?" The mistress cried, holding the child, using moral blackmail. Seeing the responsibility fall on her, my mother-in-law quickly pushed it to my father-in-law. "Old man, you know my legs are bad. You go. You're good at swimming. Just go to the entrance and see if you can find some food washed up. Wash it and we can eat." Pushed by his son and daughter-in-law and urged by his wife, my father-in-law had no choice but to put on a raincoat and go out, hoping to find something edible. But by the next day, he hadn't returned. With the floodwaters raging, once you fell in, swimming skills wouldn't save you. Chapter 11. The typhoon and torrential rain disaster had lasted a month. Despite ongoing rescue efforts, the floodwaters wouldn't recede, and resources were limited, making it impossible to help everyone. Human nature's darkness began to show. Ethan's building was full of wealthy people. Some households with ample supplies started selling a small portion of food not for money, but for women. As I had experienced in my previous life, such absurd and evil things really happened. Many people in the group began posting photos of their wives or even daughters, hoping to trade for food. I saw Ethan, ignoring Chonkian's protests, posting her photos. Afraid the big brother with supplies wouldn't be interested, he even chose photos of Chonkian in sexy lingerie. Chonkian cried and protested. But the moral blackmail she used on my in-laws was now turned against her. As a mother, what's wrong with sacrificing for your son? If anything happens to our only heir, you can't make up for it even in death. A petite woman like her was no match and could only go out crying to sell her body for supplies. I sipped hot tea, watching the ugly messages scroll by, feeling a chill. In my previous life, I was the one forced to trade my body for supplies. Ethan and the mistress tied up my daughter, threatening me. "If you don't go, I'll send your daughter to sleep with someone. There are plenty of men who like young girls." I was grateful my daughter didn't have memories of our past life. Hearing such words from her biological father, even the strongest person would struggle to cope. Fortunately, only 3 households lived in my building, and the other 2 were elderly couples who had the habit of stockpiling supplies. They had stored enough food early on and even checked on me, offering help. I was grateful for their kindness and often shared our meals with them. They reciprocated, sharing their food with us. We supported each other, making the disaster more bearable. Chapter 12. Just when I thought things had settled, an even more dramatic scene unfolded. When Ethan sent Chonkian to trade her body, he was also targeted by the big brother with a special fetish. The man promised Ethan a pack of instant noodles for one night. This time, Ethan was the one morally blackmailed. So, only my mother-in-law and the mistress's son were home that night. The next morning, the couple returned, limping and carrying a few packs of instant noodles. "Yummy, you better die out there. Don't come back." Enraged, Ethan was blocked from calling me, so he started sending hateful texts. He probably regretted not having me at home to trade for more instant noodles. I had grown accustomed to watching the surveillance of Ethan's family daily. Sometimes, if I missed the live feed, I would rewind to see any interesting content. But that day, when I opened the surveillance, my mother-in-law's lifeless face stared at the ceiling. Her head was smashed, unrecognizable. I screamed in shock and quickly reviewed the footage I had missed. It turned out Ethan and Chonkian felt they had earned the food by selling their bodies, so why should my mother-in-law enjoy it? They stopped giving her food, leaving only the broth from the instant noodles. Desperate, my mother-in-law waited at the door with a rolling pin, planning to ambush them for a pack of noodles. But a starving old woman was no match for two young people. She missed her swing and Chonkian, screaming, smashed a vase over her head repeatedly. As I watched in horror, the live feed moved again. Ethan brought a boning knife from the kitchen, and he and Chonkian crouched over the body, doing something I couldn't bear to watch. I couldn't watch any longer and quickly turned off the screen. Thinking back, my daughter and I being swept off the building by the strong wind might have been a blessing. If we had lived longer, who would have been dismembered next? Me or my daughter? Chapter 13. My mother-in-law, old and frail, couldn't sustain the starving family for long. Soon, Ethan fell ill. I saw him lying on the sofa, clutching his backside, probably unable to endure any longer after trading his body. Whether the big brother's supplies were running low or he was tired of the couple, Chonkian never went out again after one last trip. They survived on the remaining instant noodles, enduring their son's cries of hunger. I hadn't checked the surveillance for a while. When I did, Ethan, who had been lying on the sofa, was now half a man. Chonkian and her son, looking like crazed lunatics, were devouring the meat in the pot. I saved the surveillance footage of my mother-in-law and Ethan being killed and eaten. I didn't know how long Chonkian and her son would survive. But if they did, I wouldn't let them go. The law would punish these cannibalistic monsters. Shortly after Ethan's death, before his body was fully consumed, the rain stopped. After months, the first ray of sunlight pierced the sky. The wind stopped, the rain ceased. The floodwaters began to recede. The government never gave up. After the disaster, communication, water, and electricity were quickly restored, and social order gradually returned. I didn't know how many families experienced what Ethan's did, but I believed it wouldn't happen again. On the first day of normal travel, I took the evidence I had saved to the police. Chapter 14. Chonkian was taken by the police from the survivors' shelter. She was arrested for intentional homicide and malicious destruction of a corpse. I had underestimated her resilience. After everything, eating to people, she hadn't gone mad. When arrested, unaware of my surveillance, she cried to the police, claiming others in the building were responsible. Her death sentence was inevitable. As for her son, though he had eaten human flesh, he was too young and sent to an orphanage. Ethan's family finally received their due punishment. As the police thanked me for providing crucial evidence, I looked at the sunny sky and sighed in relief. The constant anxiety I had lived with finally lifted. Since Ethan and I were still legally married, I inherited all his assets. I sold the house where the murders occurred at a low price and moved to a new city with my daughter to start a new life. Using Ethan's money, I opened a small flower shop. Though it didn't make much, it covered our daily expenses. With Ethan's inheritance, we had no financial worries, but the shop gave me a sense of purpose and a small business to run. My daughter, free from the shadows of our past, became noticeably more confident and cheerful. She made new friends and consistently excelled in her studies. The nightmares that had haunted us finally dissipated. It turns out that after the storm, you really can see the rainbow.